Welcome to the Rooted Healing podcast, where we seek to deepen our kinship with the living world and with the great mystery that runs through us. This is a space where stories heal with words that weave us closer to our wild and daring natures, bringing together the expansive minds, topics, and ideas that help us heal, reimagine, and co-create the world we wish to thrive in.
And, I started learning, about spirits and complicated ceremonies and all this sort of stuff. And as I've gone on, I've got simpler and simpler and simpler, because really it's a question of going out on the land over and over and over and over again until you start feeling that you belong.
Annie Spencer is a renowned ceremonialist and beloved elder. She is a leader of vision quests and rites of passage with a background in humanistic psychology and earth-based spiritual traditions. She is also a well-loved storyteller, bringing alive the old myths of this land and connecting us with the earth and its magic as she creates spaces for wisdom and change to emerge. I drove up to Annie's house in Bath for this interview, and it felt like such a blessing to sit in Annie's home and hear her stories. I've been longing to find teachers, elders, and wholesome medicine folk on my home soil, so it's really a granted wish to a deep longing of mine to slowly find these wonderful people doing wonderful things. And this podcast is really bringing me the deepest joy in that process. This is one of my favourite episodes so far, and I don't really want to list the things we cover because I just trust you're in the right place to listen to the wisdom of a beautiful elder. I'd love to know if your story involved healing through a radical returning to the land, or if you've always been in deep kinship with it and in a spiritual way. How did that animistic approach to the land cultivate?
My mother's family farm right down in the very southwest of England, right down near the ocean. And so, although I wasn't brought up on the farm, I loved it. And my grandparents loved the land. My grandmother gave up a middle-class life to farm. And so my love of the land started from really when I was born. And it's always been very important to me. So finding a spiritual tradition that married that seemed, when it arrived, it seemed really natural and fitted into what I already knew.
Which particular traditions have been the main influences for you, or who are your teachers?
Well, I was living actually down, it's in Cornwall, I was living down in Cornwall with a small child, and someone asked me if I'd like to join this training in humanistic psychology. I didn't know what humanistic psychology was, but up for anything new. So I tried it, and we had different people come down, different experts, people who really, to come down to hold a weekend for us. And in the second year, a man called Arnold Kaiserling, who was the president of the European Association of Humanistic Psychology, came to spend a weekend with us. He was in his 80s, and he wore a cloak. And he talked the entire 2 days, and he was so fascinating. We were scribbling away till our arms were falling off. And then every sort of 2 hours or something, he brought, of course, a young, pretty woman with him. He'd stop and she'd do a bit of Tai Chi with us, and we'd recover, and then we'd carry on. And what he was talking about was Native American medicine wheel teachings and how they related to Greek mathematics and European grammar and the I Ching and astrology, sort of virtually everything. It was the most fascinating weekend. And then he discovered that we have these beautiful stone circles down in the southwest of Cornwall. And he was apprenticed to a man called Jaime Storm, who was coming over to Austria. He'd come over from Austria within a few weeks. He said, I'm going to send him to Cornwall to see your stone circles. He'll love them. So he turned up, and for 2 weeks, he gave unofficial teachings, really informal to anybody who turned up in the afternoons. My mother gave him a sherry party. And, and I felt like I'd come home. So the teachings came to me. So since the early 80s, shall I say, I can't remember exactly, I've been working with Native American teachings, what I can learn, what I can gather, what I've been blessed with from different nations ever since then. And then and I was apprenticed in one tradition for 7 years. And then about 15 years ago, 17, I don't know, I met this man, Martin Prachtel, who works with the Guatemalan Mayan tradition, and I have been incorporating that ever since, which has been a very important second sort of development on flowering. We could say flowering because it brings such beauty. And meanwhile, through all of this, I have attempted in my own way to keep the Celtic flower festivals the festivals of the year. And obviously the teachings that I've had from other lands have affected me a lot. And I have been very fortunate because a First Nations woman came from Australia at one time, and a Yoruba woman came. So I had a little bit of teachings really from all over the world.
I'm curious if you have a particular connection with the deer. Why did you choose the name Hartwell?
Isn't that interesting that you picked that up? And I thought about that, and I thought the deer is actually sacred in most traditions around the world. And here is my little book. I found there's a book called The Deer Goddess of Ancient Siberia by Esther Jacobson. It took me a long time to get it. It's a very expensive academic book. And she talks about how in the beginning, we talk about the source of all life is tied up with the tree of life. And she talks about the source of all life actually comes from an old elk mother, an old deer called Bugadi Enintin. And she would sit, how I imagine her, at the foot of the world tree. And she gave birth to all of life, but she also took all of life back in. So she was the giver of life and the taker of life, which is actually how life works. So there are many, many, many reasons that I work with the deer, but there's one for you.
I love that. The core of Native American teachings is rooted in our relatedness and interbeing within the web of life. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and how we can honor all of our relations and why this is such a powerful practice.
Where do I begin? It's who we are, but we've just forgotten. So the thing is that if you start learning about this, for many people, it makes them weep because they remember that this is who we are, that actually all this I've got, all this stuff, all this culture, everything that we have here is sitting on top of who we really are. I was thinking about this a lot because I've just come back from Finland and I've been up in Saamiland, Lapland, running a vision quest, and I talked to an old Sami woman while I was up there, and I bought a book of poetry and I went to the museum and I tried to understand a little bit, and I thought, but talking to the old woman was the best. She now lives in a house, but she used to travel with a reindeer when she was a child and live in a tent. And she didn't really talk about it. And I remember I learned a lot from my grandparents. And I remember, my grandfather understood and was a part of the land. And, he was a farmer, admittedly, but, whenever a bull got loose, even when he was in his 80s and walking with a stick, he was the one sent to get it back because he could gentle it down and bring it back, even if it was rampaging around and it was full of earth because he'd been tossing away at the hillside somewhere. And I thought the thing is, they don't have they just are that, but it's difficult because they're not self-conscious and they're not outside of it, so they don't have the concepts or the words to explain what just is for them. So it's difficult for us because as soon as we try and explain these things to ourselves, we use words that come out of our culture, which already separate us. So the only way really to do it, which is what I've learned, and, I started learning, about spirits and complicated ceremonies and all this sort of stuff. And as I've gone on, I've got simpler and simpler and simpler, because really it's a question of going out on the land over and over and over and over again until you start feeling that you belong. And for some people it's quite quick, and for some people it takes years. And then you do ceremony maybe to strengthen yourself, because to strengthen your intention, to strengthen your ability to hold your concentration, and also, most importantly, to make something of beauty to offer to life and say, thank you, I'm alive, what a gift. There's all this around me to feed me and give me places for shelter, to keep me warm. What a gift. Thank you. So now I feel that most ceremonies that I try to do are either gratitude or learning to get closer to the land. Oh, I'll tell you something else about the deer. I read a book called The Man Who Killed the Deer by Frank Waters, and it was very important to me back in the 80s. And it's written by this guy, and it's a story about a man who sent off a man from the Pueblo, one of the Pueblos, who's sent off to a boarding school, and he comes back and he wears trousers and everybody else wears skirts, and he has to try and fit in. It's very difficult for him to fit back into his culture because he's been acculturated in a different way. And one of the things that he describes in this book is a deer dance that they hold every year, and I thought, I have to go to this. So one year I made my way. It was quite a pilgrimage. All my luggage got lost. Even my coat got lost on a bus. But anyway, I finally got there, and I was staying with these friends, and they knew that my main reason for coming all the way to New Mexico was to go to this ceremony. And then when it was the day after Christmas or Christmas Day itself, I can't remember. Anyway, when it came to it, they didn't want to go. So I had to find someone I didn't really know, give me a lift, and then walk for 2 miles in the snow, because I thought, I have to go to this. And it was truly beautiful. So there you are in the snow in this little village with this mountain behind. And we were welcomed. It was one of the ceremonies that anybody was welcome to go to. And these dancers start coming from up the valley. They start coming into you. I'm going to cry as I tell you. And in the front are 2 women dressed in white, and they're the deer dancers. And they're followed by, there was a mountain lion, there was a buffalo, there were all sorts of people with great animals' heads on them dancing. They danced with great grace and huge concentration. And then there were these clowns who were jumping around in between them, making dirty jokes, which of course I couldn't understand, trying to get them to lose their concentration. If they lost their concentration, the clowns could carry them off. But also something else happened. So you had this very, very still, graceful dance going on, and this chaos, and the 2 of them knocked your mind somewhere else. That's what happened to me. And the mountain opened. So it was the most extraordinary experience. And then when they were done, they left. Such a feeling of loneliness when all these animals disappeared up the valley.
Wow. Thank you for transporting me there. This role of the joker or jester is also something that's practiced in the Camino Rojo with the sun dancers, how they tease people to distract them from this really focused prayer or keep their egos in check. And I just find it so interesting that this is a part of these ancient traditions, this joker role.
It's heyoka, isn't it? It's a very difficult role. I mean, I met people who were, training with me, and if they weren't very good, they'd say, "Oh, I must be a heyoka, I get everything wrong," and I would slightly shudder because it was very powerful. Some of the things they had to do were very extreme. It's like I've heard 2 stories. One is the Christians came and they were getting all the native people to dress up properly and go to church and be harangued by the vicar. And the heyoka didn't like this. So one day, it was a she, I think, she walked in totally naked and sat down in the front pew. Well, of course, the priest saw her and started saying how disgusting this was, etc., and how dreadful she was. Well, the whole group admired this woman, so they all got up and left the church. So that's how she got them out of the church. And then there was another story of a heyoka, and the white people were coming and they were selling beads, stuff really cheap, in return for animal furs. And they were really cheating the people, and this one saw it. So he came and set up a little stall in front of where the white people were and covered it with rubbish, and then was shouting, "Come buy my wares, see this beautiful old bone that I've got here, well gnawed by somebody," etc., etc. Well, that person's body was found in a river a few days later. So it's like, it's a very, very serious and very, very funny. But I'm sure also in terms of the dance, it's something around so that people don't get too carried away with their own brilliance. But it's working on so many different levels. It's an extraordinary... I met this woman, she came over here, grandmother, Barbara Dullknife, not so many years ago. And it took us a long time to realise that she was a heyoka. She came and she said, "Oh, I don't really know what I'm doing." And she did this sweat lodge and she said, "Oh dear, I've forgotten to do the last bit. Some of us will have to go in again." And then she took these people in and they had a really hot experience. And then she spent a lot of her time talking about, what was one of the stories, that her daughter-in-law had gone to the garage to get petrol, and she was so stupid that she got into her car, drove off without taking the petrol thing out, so she pulled the whole nozzle out of its thing, you see. And you sit there thinking, why is she telling these stories? But of course later you think, she's mimicking us who think Native American people are simple and stupid, right? And then she told a whole story about how the heyokas, about the she somehow, I don't know why, I was invited to their society, see, and then they had this big cauldron, they cooked up this dog and cut it into pieces. You can imagine how this went down around Glastonbury way. And I had to carry this bowl around, and everybody had to put their hand in and pull out a piece, and whatever piece they pulled out, to, a bit of leg, a bit of tongue, whatever it was, ho, 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 would tell them what sort of a training they were supposed to do. But she never said what she was. She just, when I look back at it, it took me a while. She poked fun at everything, but in quite an extreme way to really rattle us and knock us about a bit.
So interesting. You were speaking about how ceremony has, for you, become more and more simple in a way. I'd love it if you could speak about the art of ceremony. Does ceremony belong to everyone? What are the key components that really make a space sacred and intentional?
What would be the most important? The important thing, I think, to remember is that it doesn't come easy, and it takes a lot of time to really build the energy so that you can build a power. So when I did that thing at Medicine Fest, I'd never done a ceremony for so many people. How many were there? 500,000? It was a lot of people. But it's like the form was quite simple, but we held it strong enough that we took all those people with us, didn't we? So they didn't start laughing. Well, there were some who did something, we've got our own song, but by and large, and they focused and they kept their focus. So that's the important thing about ceremony. That's what takes the time, is to be able to build energy, open it up and hold it. But the form is not nearly so important. So I see people who do really complicated forms, but they don't actually have that strength which is built up really over years of just doing ceremony. Now your question was more than that. Intention is really important. You're very clear about what you're doing. So what you're really doing is you're making a space, so you try and, which you hope that spirit and or spirits or power or whatever, in whatever form that you understand, will come in and something will happen. So the first thing is to make some space of beauty, because why should spirit come in unless there's something attractive? Maybe it smells delicious, maybe it looks beautiful, maybe you sing beautiful songs, maybe you drum beautifully, maybe you're dressed in a beautiful way. All these things matter because you're calling to spirit and you're not saying, hey, come here, servant, I want you. I hear people talking about my animal and my totem. They're not mine. They are beings in their own right. And if I'm so incredibly fortunate, maybe they'll come and help me. But I have to remember to be grateful, and I have to remember that they have their own way of being, which I probably don't understand at all. So it's making a space with a very clear intention, because life is responding all the time. But if you don't have a clear intention, it's very difficult for life to know how to respond. It's very difficult also to know what response you're supposed to be picking up on. So those two things are really important. I think, yes, anyone can try and do ceremony. I mean, this man, Arnold Keyserling, who came back in the 80s, he said, say you've got something that you want. Here's a thing I suggest to you. You make a ceremonial space. That can be really simple, but choose a time of day that you will always be free for, say, 10, 20 minutes. Find a handkerchief, preferably a clean one. Put it down in front of you, and then sit and focus on whatever your question is every day. And he says, I would say within a month, an answer will come to you. So that's a very, very simple form of ceremony. So anybody can try and do whatever ceremony they want. But also I have found that going to a culture that hasn't torn itself to shreds. You remember our culture here in Britain? We killed our witches, we drowned them, we burnt them, we imprisoned them, we tortured them. Most were women, some were men. We betrayed people in our own village. We betrayed people in our own family. There's such pain, and there's been such a destruction within our own culture, whereas people like the First Nations people from North America, or the people from Central America, or the First Nations people from Australia, or wherever, they didn't destroy each other. They were destroyed from outside. Some of them barely cling to their culture at all and are suffering hugely from the abuse, you know, with alcoholism and abuse carrying on. But at least they haven't polluted, if you like, with all this violence, their own spiritual ways of doing things. So if you go to them, if there are any of them left, and you learn their practices, then you learn a lot about how to do ceremony in a good way. And you come back, and maybe for a long time you have to practice their ways. I mean, that was another thing, you know, I've been doing this for a long time. And when we started off, you know, there was no teachers, there was nothing. So, you know, I was in 2 sweat lodges, I think, and I went to some festival and they said, you've got to hold a sweat lodge for us. You know, I thought, well, all right, you know, because we were all a bit mad like that. So I sort of did what I could. I came out, there was someone who'd been sitting outside my sweat lodge listening to what I was doing because he thought he'd learn. Oh, I thought I'd learn about the 4 doors, you know, Rainbow Sweat Lodge. So I just looked at him and thought, you idiot, I know nothing. But that's how we were carrying on. And that guy, but it was dangerous because we didn't really know what we were doing. And it was a bit like the first people who took acid, you know, some died. And the first people who got into ceremonial work and didn't know what we were doing, he went crazy. He became schizophrenic. He had to be hospitalized. I remember another woman who walked into the sea and drowned. You know, it's like the sea is very dangerous. I've taken people to the sea. And once we did a little thing. Someone found driftwood. We lit this beautiful fire on the beach and we were doing some little thing with it. And suddenly, what happened? Someone said, is it time to go? And I looked round and the sea was rushing towards us and knocked one of us over. And it had been nowhere near us. It's like, you start doing ceremony by the sea, you have to be careful because the sea is quite excitable. Or quite like to take any of us. So I'm coming back to, so we didn't know what we were doing, which was all we could do. And then teachers started arriving. But now that there are teachers here, I would be really critical of someone who held a sweat lodge after they'd only been around for twice, but that's all we could do. But now it's different. And if you follow a tradition that has been going for a long time, for some years, it all takes years. That's the other thing. You know, we think, oh, we'll go, oh, we'll learn something and then we'll have it because that's how our culture works. And I was reading this book the other day and I can't remember the name of the man, I'm sorry. And it was quite a simple book, but he was saying, you know, if a Lakota man, maybe he and a young woman want to get married, so he has to go and ask her hand in marriage from her father, and her father, or marriage or whatever they called it, and her father might say, well, we'll see what you're made of. Bring me a buffalo, or bring me 2 horses from that group who live over there. And then you think, oh yes, very romantic. But actually, the guy was saying, to bring a buffalo, he would have had to have made stone arrowheads, probably with flint, and gone on and on and on, cutting them thousands before he got one strong enough to pierce the hide of a buffalo. He'd have had to learn how to make the shaft of the arrow, how to fleck with the arrow, with the feathers, what feathers to get, how to find them, never mind the making of the bow, never mind them practicing in the hunt. So it was like, this was testing whether he'd done years of work. And there's something about our instant culture, and I can say as an elder now, an older woman, it's like, to get where I've got to, where I could feel confident to do a ceremony for so many people, has taken me many years. I was very shy. My ceremonies were quite tight when I started off. But if you keep going, and you keep going, it's worth it.
Yeah, that leads to a point that I've questioned a lot, which is seeking teachers and practices from other traditions without wanting to repeat any colonial models of appropriation and extraction. And you've just spoken about this instant culture we have in the West. And I worry when I see a poster, for example, that says, join this shamanic 2-week training and become a shaman. And yet there's also such a deep yearning to learn that comes from a pure place, and from which we are all recovering from a loss of these ancient practices on our own lands. What are your thoughts on this?
I've lived through that a while because there was the American Indians. There was a big political movement and there was a big fight going on among them when I was training. You know, Sunbear was one of the first people who brought the teachings out to the West. And rumour has it that some Native American people were so angry, they rolled him up in barbed wire. And then there was this woman, Jamie Sams. I mean, he's long dead. There was this woman, Jamie Sams, that animal cards deck. Most people know about her. She's dead now too. She came over and she brought another set of, what was it? The Sacred Path cards, I think. And they'd come out just when she was in Bath giving a workshop, and she sat there in front of us all and wept and said, I'm really frightened because I've given out so many teachings and I know so many people will be so angry with me. And a lot of people are angry with me because I am 3/4, was it Choctaw? Apologies if I have given her the wrong nation. But she said I was not brought up on reservation, so some people won't accept me. So there was a fight went on between the people who said we've got to bring these teachings out because these people have to learn, and those who said they have stolen everything from us and this is our last thing and now they're going to steal that from us. So I think it's very difficult, and I think each person has to be aware each step of the way. That my first teacher came and he said, well, you know, I believe people are born and born again and born again. I suspect quite a lot of my people have been reborn as Germans. Maybe some Nazis have been reborn now in my nation. What do I know? You know, what is it? So it's a difficult thing because it's nationalism. But there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do by honouring it. It's like I put people out on Vision Quest. I've been doing it a long time. And people are doing it all over the place. Great, wonderful. But a lot of people sort of slide over it by saying, this is a practice that is pan-national. Pan-national is the word they use. You know, it's been practiced all over the world. So it's fine that we do it. And I think, but just a minute, what is the form that we're all using? The Lakota people held sweat lodge, they held uwipi, they held the ceremony of the pipe, they held vision quest when everyone else forgot them. So actually, this is a form that has come from those First Nations people in America, and we need to honor them. The least we can do is honor them every time we introduce it and say, this is who it's come from. These are the people who held it while they were being persecuted, while they weren't allowed to hold their ceremonies until the 1970s. You know, they were imprisoned or killed or worse. And many people from different nations around North America went to them because everybody died and they'd forgotten a lot of their traditions. And the second, just as important thing is, what can I give back? Can I give back in supporting them, things like Standing Rock? Can I give back with money? Because like at the Rosebud Reservation, Pine Ridge Reservation, you know, the Lakota people are very, very, very poor. And a lot of people are alcoholic. And so there's this woman, Barbara Dullknife, who I was talking about, the wild woman with the bowl full of pieces of dog. She has set up where she lives. She lives in a trailer. She usually is overcrowded because she has relations staying with her who have nowhere to live. And she's set up a home for children because when people get drunk, when they fight, which they do, the police come in and pick them up. The children are left alone, so they're taken to some home which is off the reservation, maybe 50 miles away. So she's trying to raise money to set up one of those on her reservation. So there's masses to be done in all sorts of ways. The first thing always is to tell a story and honour them. So you say this comes from the Lakota people. You don't just say that. You say, and this is what they had to do to hold it. And this is what our people did to them. So you tell a whole big story. So you're honouring them and they're not forgotten. And then you do something in a physical way as well.
Yes. Embodying the reciprocity, which is at the root of the teachings. I'm glad that you've mentioned the Vision Quest, as I've supported a few in Ecuador, but have often wondered about a tradition being carried closer to home and what that might look like. So I'd love to hear how you hold your Vision Quests and what your thoughts are on this form of prayer.
I hold them in Cornwall because it's my land. So, you know, I don't want to hold them anywhere else, really. I just held one in Lapland because his friend persuaded me to go there. And she's from Finland, so I thought, all right, between us. But, you know, I don't know that land. I don't know the beings of that land. I don't know the energy of that land. It was very quiet, and actually it was the most strange Vision Quest because everybody on it got COVID. Oh, wow. So we had enough to do dealing with people coming in and out, being sick in various ways. And I learned a little bit about the land, and it's immediately on the surface, it's very tender and it's very kind. But as his friend said, also underneath, it's very powerful. So we didn't go too deep that time, but Cornwall, the southwest of Cornwall, is very powerful. That if you think of the boot, and it's the toe that I like, and the toe goes out, and there's a narrow bit of land that I don't know. How wide is it? 3 or 4 miles or something between Hale and Marazion. And for centuries it was a marsh. And a causeway was only built across that marsh in Victorian times. So it's been very cut off from the civilization of the rest of the country. And the walls on my family's farm were built in I think it was the Bronze Age. You know, they're still the same walls. And the stone circles are quite small. They're not huge and wonderful like Stonehenge. So not so many tourists go. So you feel that the old culture has not been so overlaid. I came up here and I went to stone circles and I thought, there's so many layers on top of them, it's quite hard to find them. So the land's quite wild, are quite old, and somewhere the ways of the people who lived really in the land are still rememberable. So that's why I do it down there. So the people who come down have to do the best they can with the land that they may not know. But it means that I can call to the spirit of the land, and I can try and open the place up for them a little, if it works. Why is wishing well? See, I do it because I love doing it. I mean, that's really why I go on holding them when I've given up a lot of different bits of my work, because I'm older now and I haven't got that much energy, and I think I've been doing it for years, but because I love teaching about it, and then everyone goes out to quest, and my job is to pray with the land for 4 days with maybe an assistant, and I don't have to go on teaching. I can just walk the land, sit there with the fire and pray and drum and sing. How beautiful for me. That's my main purpose for doing it. But it is it's very interesting. Again, it's probably something that people need to do maybe more than once, because for some people it's a real rest just to sit for 4 days with nobody else, nothing electronic, no food to cook, nothing. Some people spend a lot of time sleeping. Some people, people get frightened before they go. They're afraid they'll starve to death. They're afraid they'll freeze to death, or they'll be too hot, or something unnameable will come and kill them, or whatever it is. But when they're actually out there, those fears usually fall away. Not for everyone, but for a lot of people. And so for some people, it's just resting. For some people, they really maybe there's a little plant sitting next to them, and they make a great connection with that plant. And some people have visions, and some people have very difficult times and go out a long way. It's such a personal thing, it's sort of impossible to describe. And some people go out with a very clear intention, and so it's quite easy to see what comes back for them. And some people don't have such a clear intention, but they just want to go, and they're not sure why. So it's maybe also it's a ceremony where the participants do work. There's no way they can get away with being an audience or watching, which is in a lot of ceremonies people quite like to do. It's without them, their ceremony doesn't exist, and they're out there by themselves, and they're out there by themselves with the weather, and some are quite shocked. I remember one person, I tell this story quite a lot, blessings on you, I don't remember your name even, but anyway, when they look for their place, then I come and see, is it okay, and is someone else to, all that sort of stuff, and in case they don't come back, well, I know where to go and find them. And she was standing on this little wall, and her hair was horizontal in the wind, and I said, it might be a bit windy for you here. And she said, wind? What are you talking about? And she hadn't got it. Somewhere she was so unused to responding to the weather that the fact that her hair was horizontal in the wind meant nothing to her. She hadn't connected with that. So, for some people, it's just being out in the weather. And in Cornwall, it's rather, the weather changes a lot. Generally, there's rain, there may be sun if you're lucky, there could be mist. Once there was the end of a hurricane came in while they were out, and it was incredibly windy one night. And my assistant came and woke me up and said, what should we do? What should we do? My tent is leaking. And we sat there with sort of drips coming down. The tarpaulin for the seating place had been broken, torn. Should we go out and rescue them, see if they're all right? Or should we not? And I decided not to, because I thought, if they get through it, they'll have such a sense of achievement. And when they came back, one had tent zip had been broken and her sleeping bag had been soaked, but she'd stood the next day and held it up in the wind and it had dried, and she felt so fantastic. It's extreme. So I don't know, I think it's in a way, it's a simple form, isn't it? You just go out with a little tent and no food and some water, and you just sit there. For mine, you can't walk around. So you put stuff around you, so like you're making an altar that you're sitting on to converse with life. So it's a very simple form, but very powerful. So I expect And again, I want to honor those people who held it, and out of their generosity were prepared to teach us. See, that's what we have to honor, that some of them were so generous that in spite of what they'd suffered from Europeans, they were still prepared to teach us.
Yeah. Thank you for speaking to that. Can you also speak to the importance of rite of passage? I'm particularly interested in hearing about how the adolescent stage of life could be so much more celebrated, honored, and supported by the principles of nature and community.
It's such a quandary. I've started doing rites of passage just for young women. So we take 8 a year, which is sort of, in our millions of people, is nothing. But again, it's such, if you're going to do it, that is such a big venture out of our culture. So I keep thinking young men have started coming and saying, what about us? And I look around at the men around me and I sort of, not sure. And I think, is it a time when women could teach men? Would that be all right? Because it feels like a time where we're coming up. We spent much longer working with these earth-based spiritual traditions because we had nowhere to go. We had to find somewhere, didn't we? We had to find something. So we've been doing it for decades, whereas men didn't in the same way. So some of them are a little, apologies, maybe behind us. And I think, people say, well, can one do rites of passage? And people do for children leaving school, and the rite of passage is a marriage and a baby naming and a funeral. All these different things are rites of passage. But again, what I'm trying to do, I went to North America for 11 years. And this guy, I was very, very fortunate how it happened. And I was able to be part of a small team putting on a rite of passage that had been brought out of Guatemala. For 1 year we did it for young women, 1 year we did it for young men. So we were mixed. Most of us women, some of us men, working with both of them. So maybe it's possible. And then it was formally finished. And then I came back to England, but I had promised every year that I would not use the form myself. But there was this push, you've got to do something, and I feel quite a strong connection with those. I've not been to Guatemala, and I could feel them saying, come on. So in the end, I took my courage and we've started something, and within the ceremony, it has to be what has come through for us. And slowly things are beginning to come through from this land, which is quite exciting, but quite bumpy. You can imagine. It's like when this land is full of rage and grief about what we've lost, and people are full of rage and grief about what we've lost. So if something comes through, that it has to come through that rage and grief, which can be quite difficult. But it's an interesting thing, because really what I was taught was that a rite of passage for young people, the first purpose is to feed the holy, to feed the sacred, to feed life, to make a beautiful, great ceremony. And again, I say everyone's dressed beautifully, they sing beautifully, the ceremony is wonderful, a feast is made, the deck. All of this is a perfumed offering so that we hope that spirit might be fed a little, because we take so much and never realize that somewhere there has to be a balance and there has to be a giving back. So that's the first purpose of it. The second purpose of it is to feed the community. So we have, obviously, in this culture, the young women who come from different communities, and we say, please bring, and quite often some of their parents will come, at least for the last day, or a friend or something. But we invite them, but also there are some people who are trying to come regularly, so that there is a community who send them off, there's a community who welcome them back, and then there's a community who they can, if they want to, see later on through the year for as long as they like, being careful that this is not a cult, so we have to be. So the second thing is this whole thing feeds that community of people, because life's hard. advertising has a lot to answer for, because it says your life should be happy. And I sit here saying, life's hard. It's a miracle we ever survive, actually. We're such tiny little beings. And so to go and do a ceremony like that and all enjoy it and feel the spirit and feel the power of it, then we can go back into life and continue a little longer because we feel fed. So that's the second purpose of it. And that little bit was what I was trying to do in Medicine First, was to bring a bit of joy for everyone to feel. And the third and last purpose is to initiate the young people. So they're way down the line, but they're needed because also their initiation is the core around which everything happens. So it's interesting to do it that way round. And yes, they're taken away and there's a 4-day ceremony for them, and they have to prepare for it for 8 or 9 months beforehand. There's quite a lot to do. So it's quite a thing. And in a way, the ceremony is quite a small part of it. And then the other end, they're asked if they would come back to the community for another period. And then they do what they like. Some of them come back, some of them don't, depending on their lives.
And how do these people find you? How old are they? Is it a rite of passage for the adolescent?
There's an interesting thing. I mean, in Guatemala, they look for the kids, and when the kids start showing an interest in the opposite sex, that's when they take them, because emotionally they're opening up, but they're still, in that time of adolescence, it's all very soft and malleable and changing. So it's a good time to imprint, we could say, some stuff on them that might be useful for them when they're grown up. Well, obviously 14-year-olds, I've taken 14-year-olds out into the woods. They're not yet interested in anything much other than having a good time and can they smoke round a fire, and playing games, etc. They're great, they're wonderful. And then, so we thought maybe 17 and 18-year-olds, but they're really caught up in the education system. They have no time. So we started off with sort of 19 to 29, and that seemed quite old. So we brought it back to 18 to 25, and we'll see. So it's young women, and it is a rite of passage into adulthood and into, as far as we can, making some strong connection with the land and who they are. So they have some root inside themselves and some seed, so that when things do whatever, but it's nothing to do with their psychology. So it is a rite of passage for young people, but where it'll go and who it'll really be for in the end, who knows? This Martin Prachtel, he said a thing that took me a long time to realize it. He said, you have to understand that what we're doing is planting seeds for a time beyond our own. And that's a great relief when you think, I've not got to get it all right and change the world right now. That's beyond me. But I can start things off that maybe will make a big difference 3 or 4 generations down the line. And that's the best I can do.
Yes, it's so needed. So in a culture that is becoming ever more increasingly analytical and thought-based, how can ancient wisdom in the deep understanding of our belonging with the land as our journey of healing and interconnectivity be transmuted into our therapeutic paradigm? Does ecopsychology do this? And what has been your process with merging these two worlds?
Well, you see, first of all, I love exploring new things. I have to say this. So, but secondly, I did this training in ecopsychology where this native man came, and that started me on that path. But I did also become a therapist, a psychotherapist. And I've had to practice all that time as well. And for a long time, I kept my 2 paths separate, because I thought when someone comes for therapy, it's not up to me to lay my belief system on them. Although, they'd have dreams about me stirring a cauldron and things, and I'd sit there sniggering to myself, go on, this is none of your business. So it was very funny. So when ecopsychology came along, I thought, well, that'd be very interesting. Maybe here's where the two combine. And so what did I do? I jumped into teaching it, these 2 other people. And so I explored it for quite a few years. But in the end, for myself at the moment, I know it's still, it's He's got a long way to go because, I trained in psychology, so it wasn't so much talking because I did a lot of work in Neo-Reichian body work, which is working with how stress is held in the body and how to release that. And although I wasn't one of those ones who really, when I was taught it, you were there sort of getting people to push against you and kick against you, and I've never been that strong a person for a great man to kick me across the room, but I've had them kick on a mattress and things like that. So to me, it's very important. The body and the imagination are very important, not just the concepts. I think things move much quicker then, and catharsis. And going to the earth, going to the plants is very healing for us. And it's a very complex shift, because actually, if you're going to start working with people outside, you've got to throw out a whole load of your methodology from the way you've been working in a room. I know someone who does it in London, and she's very fortunate. Her back garden opens onto Hampstead Heath. So she can take people out into the woods like that. Whereas, for me, I had to get in the car and drive off somewhere and meet someone and then take them for a walk till we found a suitable place. So it was wildly impractical, really. And the other thing that I found was that the earth-based spiritual path that I've been practicing, for me, takes me way into a much deeper relationship with the natural world than ecopsychology. So it felt for me like stepping backwards. But I think it's a great thing that people are starting to do it. And I think they'll find it's a long journey to really, really integrate it as a methodology of its own. Because here we are sitting in a room, and I'm working, if we were working, on our relationship, and the room is quite containing. But I've noticed, running groups out of doors, it's like the energy can go like that, and it's sometimes harder to hold it all together. So same with you and a person, and you yourself have to be a long way ahead of the person that you're working with. So you have to have a really intense, deep connection with the land, and that has to go. I mean, I've been to ecopsychology gatherings, and there are all sorts of very interesting things that are being discussed, like how we have to change our language, or we can't, our language keeps throwing us back into this separation. So I'm not really doing it anymore, I have to say, and that's for me what I found. So it felt at this stage in my life also, I didn't want to spend I didn't want to go there. And so I still see clients in a room. But a lot of what I'm more interested in is how you can work ceremonially with trauma. And I'm learning a bit about that from old stories when someone does something wrong. And then what has to be done to heal that wrong, or for them to cleanse of the wrongdoing that they've done. That really interests me. That's my latest thing. Maybe get someone to cleanse themselves in a river for 40 days, or sit by a fire every night for 40 nights and feed it with something, whatever. I think that's really interesting, and that may be way through. I'm not a shamanic practitioner, so I haven't, because that came after. I'm so old that I was already into something by the time. And shamanism really came from the East, didn't it? From Siberia and the Altai Mountains. And I have my friend in Finland, she went that way and trained, and I went west. And it's like, I always say, go the path that calls your heart. It doesn't matter if it's the most impressive or the most sophisticated. If it calls your heart, then you have some connection with it already and follow it. And so I've always been pulled west.
I love that idea of healing trauma and shame or guilt with ritual. It reminds me of Francis Weller's work with grief tending. And in a ceremonial space, I've been shown a type of ceremony where everyone in the circle are there to heal the person in the middle. For example, I saw a cancerous tumor shrinking in the central person with this process.
I've done that. One thing I want to say about cancer, you have to be really careful. I remember this guy Swifty saying his uncle had cancer. His uncle was, a Christian and believed in medicine, etc. But when after all the medicine had failed, he came to him and they did sweat lodge healing for him and he recovered. But a year later, his wife died of cancer. You have to be really, really careful because it can jump around. And if you don't know how to protect yourselves, it might jump into someone else. I did learn to do exactly what you're talking about. I wonder what we can. And it was when I was really into medicine wheel teaching. So we'd hold a wheel around this person, and each person would hold either the physical or the spiritual or the ancestral, and then we would hold sort of parts of them. And then we would respond energetically to what came through because we weren't attached. We're all attached to our stories. It was much easier for us to let the energy just move. But again, there was a safeguard. So one person, their job was to see if they could call for this person's book of karma, is what we called it. And then see if it would open. And if it would open, that's where we'd begin from. And then it was how long. It would say, that's enough, you can't do anymore. And occasionally it wouldn't open. And so we understood that whatever was going on for that person, it wasn't for us to interfere, and all we could do was give a blessing and spend some time sending good energy to them. It is a very interesting way, but you see, you've got to get a whole group of people who've trained with you in the same way for long enough. It's wonderful. We did all sorts of extraordinary things.
Wow, yes, I believe it. We've covered a lot of ground, so to round off, do you have any expressions of hope for our collective reconnection with land and spirit, and perhaps even a story to leave us with?
Oh yes, a story. I have a little story. Hope. I'm a hopeful person. I've done quite a lot of activism recently. And one of the activist things is we shouldn't have any hope. I can't be doing with that. We have to live with hope. And sometimes we feel despair. I always think what's going to happen next is not really up to us. We do what we can. And life will do what it wants, and we will have to do our best to deal with it. But I do have hope. I feel there are a lot of changes going on. It was like some decades ago, acupuncture, homeopathy, cranial osteopathy, all these practices were starting. And they were quite hidden. And now they've got to the point where almost anyone you meet in the street, they or someone they know well has had one of those alternative treatments. And as they raise up above the parapet, then the forces that be try to shut them down. And I feel the same thing is happening now. There's a huge amount of change. I think our culture is in a very advanced state of collapse. And I think the new is already there, but it's not quite visible enough yet. But there are people all over the place living in different ways, farming in different ways, having different spiritual practices, educating everything in different ways. There's so much going on all over the world. And I don't know if I'll be alive to see it. I'm clinging in here because I want to. And I feel there's going to be big disturbances. It's not going to be easy for the generation who are coming up. But then my parents' generation had to live through war, and my grandparents' generation had to live through 2 wars. And, people being killed with likes happening in Ukraine. So as I said, life's hard, But I have a story. a story about a girl and a fox. And so there was this family, and they lived in the north, far in the north somewhere. So in the winters were very hard. There was snow and ice outside. It was freezing temperatures, and you stayed as far as you could in your home with your fire, keeping you warm and enough firewood to keep you going for the winter. Anyway, there was this little family, young family, father and mother. So far, they had one daughter who they adored, and she got ill. It seemed like she got a fever. I don't think they called it flu in those days. Anyway, and the mother, everybody had a few herbs that they'd gathered, foraging during the summer. So she tried everything she had, but it didn't make any difference for her daughter. So she turned to her husband and said, I think we've got to call in the old woman, the old herbalist of the village, because we need her, because I can't, nothing's making any difference. I'm really worried. She's had this fever for a little while now, and it's quite high. And the man said, fine. So he put on his clothes, he went out, and he came back with the old woman, and she came with a basket full of roots and leaves and little potions. And she came in, and she took off her outer clothes, and they gave her a chair, and she sat down by the little girl, where the little girl was lying, tossing and turning. And she said nothing. She sat there for quite a while. And the mother was really, you get a bit rude when you're frantic. She was really frantic. Why don't you start giving us something? What's going on? Hurry up. I'm really worried my girl will die. She might die. And the old woman just ignored her and sat there for a while longer. And then she turned to the man and she said, somewhere out there, not that far away, there's a fox, a female fox. She's starving. You need to find her and bring her back here so that she can be fed and not die. All right. So she had spoken. So the man put on, he had these beautiful skin boots that had sort of rabbit fur inside, and these trousers and thick furry coat and a hat and mittens, and his wife gave him some dried meat, because who knows how long it was going to take him to find this fox. And off he went. And he hadn't gone far, and he saw these tracks, fox tracks. So he started following them. And he followed, and he hurried, but fox soon caught wind of him, so she hurried ahead of him. So all day he tracked her, and all day she ran from him. And the days are quite short in the winter, so quite soon it got dark, and he thought, well, I won't be able to track in the dark, so I'll have to find some sticks and make a fire and just lie down here for the night. So he found some sticks, and he lit a fire for himself, and he got out some of his dried meat to eat, and he took a little bit, and he put it quite a way beyond the light of the fire. And he rolled himself up in his clothes and did his best to sleep through the freezing night. And the next morning, the first thing he did when he woke up was went and had a look. The meat had gone. Good. And some tracks, the fox tracks, had come. So at least you can see in the snow, you can see everybody's tracks. So he said, good. She's somewhere, she's not too far away. She hasn't disappeared from me. So he followed those tracks, but she still ran, hungry and exhausted as she was. She still ran from him all day, and the same thing happened. And that night, he put the meat a little closer, and he went to sleep, and he had a fire, and the fire sort of kept him warmish. But when you're cold, you don't sleep very well. Anyway, the next morning, the meat had gone, and he thought, God, this fox, how can she keep up? And he felt he was gaining on her, because she was tired, and she hadn't had time to even look for food. She just had a tiny bit of meat, and he had more. Anyway, come the third night, chasing her, he thought, she's not that far away. Sat down, made his fire. This time he put the meat right in the firelight, quite close to himself, and he pulled out a cloth that he brought from his bag. And he didn't go to sleep. He sat there and waited. And he didn't have to wait that long, but a little nose came forward. We've got foxes in my back lane. I know all about them now. And the ears were pricked up. She looked at him, he looked at her. She backed away again, but she was so hungry that she came again, and this time her attention was on the meat, and he threw that cloth, and he caught her. And he pulled her inside his jacket, and he thought, even though it's night, I can start on my way home. And he started walking, and he walked that night, and most of the next day, and finally he got home in the afternoon, and he opened the door, and he said, so how are things? The old woman said, have you got the fox? And he said, yes, but how's my daughter? And his wife said, I'm distraught. She's as sick as ever. She's still got a temperature, and all the old woman's been doing is sitting beside her. I don't know what to do. Well, we'll see, he said, because I brought the fox. What shall I do? with her. He said to the old woman, shut the door and set her down and give her some food, build up the fire so that she's warm. So the fox ate and she drank and she curled up by the fire and she went to sleep. Well, said the old woman, this is good. Don't worry, it'll be all right. So they all went to sleep, and the next morning they woke up and the old woman looked at the fox and said, she needs another day. So another whole day, the little girl's still feverish. Maybe it's slightly less, but she's still very sick. And the fox is eating and eating and sleeping and sleeping and eating and drinking and sleeping. And then they all go to bed, and the next morning they wake up and the old woman looks at the fox and says, it's time, you can open the door, she can go. So they opened the door and the fox disappeared into the snow. And hardly had she gone, but the little girl stretched and yawned and looked around and sat up and said, what's for breakfast, Mum? I'm starving. And the old woman said, well, I'm done now, aren't I? And she picked up her basket and she put her coat on and she went to the door and she turned around and she said, so who healed whom? And she walked out the door.
You can visit Annie's website at heartwell.eu.com to learn more about her work. Heart as in H-A-R-T, the deer. And join us at patreon.com/rootedhealing to access a transcript of this episode, along with so many beautiful offerings from our podcast guests and community. That space is getting richer and richer with resources to enrich your healing journey. And it's also a beautiful way for us to connect, exchange ideas, and support each other. And you can join from just £1 a month and already have access to workshops, meditations, transcripts, book sharing, and so much more. As suggested by Annie in this episode, if you've received the beauty of Lakota healing traditions, or if you generally would like to give something, I thought it'd be nice to link you to a page where you can donate to the Lakota people. And there's a few ways to give, but I've chosen friendsoflakota.org, so feel free to follow that link to practice some reciprocity. Find out what we're up to at rootedhealing.org. We have opportunities to gather in person and online in the coming months. Definitely sign up to our newsletter for early bird discounts and generally staying connected. And before you go, I'd love to read a recent testimonial from our Deep Remembering retreat. This is from a powerful women's transformational coach, Katinka Nowak, who came along. I don't feel like I can quite put into words how powerful the Deep Remembering retreat was for me. Ronnie and Pierre created magic beyond what I thought was ever capable. They are truly gifted in this work, and I hope that they are able to touch as many souls and hearts as they can in this world, as our world desperately needs them and the work they do. The week they created for us had a vast variety of experiences for us to surrender into, with detail and love put into each activity and gathering. At all times, they made us feel so held and looked after, yet also craftily created a space that felt safe and encouraging to go deep into, quote, the work in, which I hugely appreciated and needed. I have made sisters for life, and this experience will remain in my heart forever. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I can't wait to come to another retreat. Well, thank you so much, Katinka, for your wisdom and presence in that circle. It was a magical week with a group of beautiful women. And it can sometimes feel quite silly reading testimonials out, but I do it so that you, dear listener, can trust that this work works, and that carefully crafted ceremonial and ritualistic creative spaces where our wild and mystical connection with land, people, and the web of life really can heal us and help us remember our true nature and gifts. And so as we go into these darker winter months, we need to find our own unique way to carry this nourishment with us and find ways to cultivate our own sense of belonging to the land and our community. So if you do want to gather with us, go to rootedhealing.org/gather to see what's next. I'm your host, Veronica Stanwell, with music from Mike Howe, Chris Park, and Dory Joy. Thanks for listening.